Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Tulley. I'm a senior writing coach at Defend and Publish, and welcome to episode 20, Technical Writing Blocks. So for the next couple of weeks, I'm going to focus on different types of writing block experiences you might be having. We usually hear the phrase, I have writer's block thrown around in a couple of different contexts, but not all writer's blocks are the same. And so over the next 4 weeks, we'll explore the different types of writer's blocks you might be having and some different ways that you might be able to solve them. So this week, I want to focus on technical writing blocks. And these are writing blocks that are related to related to the problem that you don't know how to solve. So for a lack of a better word. So these are usually that you could sum it up in a sentence to say that you're stuck because you don't know what to do next. And this problem is sort of interesting in the way that if you knew the answer, you would probably just keep writing, or the hope is that you would just keep writing. But it's also a difficult problem to solve because sometimes you have no idea how to solve the problem. And so we're just going to walk through 4 different strategies that might give you some ideas about how to get over the hump for something like this. So one of the things that I like to do, probably my favorite strategy, is to really embrace what the problem is and then dig into it and do a lot of research. So for example, there's tons of academic writing guides out there. There's lots of academic writing support. Certainly this podcast is one of those things. There's academic coaching companies. There's tons of books. Many of us have maybe heard of Paul Silva's How to Write a Lot, or Wendy Belcher's How to Write a Journal Article in 12 Weeks. Those resources are definitely great for digging into your writing problems. But one of the things that I like to do too is to look at how other writers are solving problems. So for me, it's not just enough to get the advice from an advice guide, because I think we all know what happens, that sometimes advice works for one person, it might not work for another person. So advice guides are great, but I think it also helps to know how other writers are trying to solve the problem. So there's 2 things that I would recommend in this context, just generally. Any interviews with any faculty writers are wonderful because you find out a lot about how faculty go about solving problems. Even things like a lack of resources, or maybe they had a thorny methodology section that they worked through. And one great book I want to recommend on this front is Helen Sword's Air, Light, Time, and Space. Again, that was Helen Sword's Air, Light, Time, and Space. And I like this because she interviews faculty writers and actually finds out nuts and bolts about how they're going about solving their problems, including many of the technical issues that you might run into. So let me give you 2 examples of some technical issues that you might run into, and then how I might go about solving those. One of them would be, and this is a common problem, I think, for graduate students or newer faculty, but I think, and actually all of us, maybe we all have trouble probably figuring out what to include and what to exclude when we're writing a literature review chapter or a literature review portion of an article or a book. It is very difficult. There's so much written out there on all of our subject areas that it's tough. How do you decide what goes in and what stays out? And so if I was going to try to solve this problem, let's say I was stuck because I really wasn't sure how to make that determination. These are 2 sources I have used to solve this problem. One, I mentioned Wendy Belcher's How to Write a Journal Article in 12 Weeks. She does have a chapter on a literature review, and I like that chapter because it forces you to go through a series of questions to determine what actually really has to be in your article or your chapter. So I like that because it basically forces you to kind of think about your subject matter a little bit better, to decide, oh, this is something superfluous, I don't really need this. This might be a footnote, but it doesn't have to actually be something I'm talking about in great depth. It just sorts through those threads. So I really like that one. But on a building side, if you are building a literature review for the first time, one of the best sources I found out there, I'm actually using this right now with my graduate students in the fall. It is called How Scholars Write We'll put a link to it in the show notes. This book is wonderful in just breaking apart how to build a literature review from scratch, including how to take notes on all kinds of things, how to decide what goes in the literature review, how to think about how sources interact with each other. But both of those books, the 12 Weeks and the How Scholars Write, both of those are resources that you can use to solve a technical writing problem, right? So that's another way to think about it. A second one might be like, let's say you don't know how to write about a specific methodology because you're using a newer methodology you're not familiar with. This is something that I had to do when I was working on a book that's currently in progress on time use diaries. I've mentioned it before. I have not used time use diary study as a method ever. And so I needed to learn how to do that. So of course, one way that I did this was by looking through other time use study articles to see what are the fundamental resources that all of these articles are calling on, or what are some of the things that are essential to have in a methodology section on time use diary. The other thing that I did is I also just looked through the academic databases for any articles on time use study and looked at those. So it didn't matter whether they were in my discipline of rhetoric and writing or not. I looked at some in psychology. I looked at some in science. I looked at all kinds of ones. But the more that I looked at them, I could see some patterns in how the researchers would talk about time use study and some of the language they were using. So that's another way to think about solving a technical problem. So then I also have three other suggestions with much shorter commentary on them, but it's always a great idea. Strategy number two would be asking somebody or crowdsourcing. So these can work in two different ways. One way would be if you go on Twitter, there are many academic groups where you can ask questions. And I will also put another link to one in the show notes that is a good one where you can ask questions. And it's basically a spot where you can post a question on Twitter and have the academic Twitter community answer your question. I love this. I don't see any drawbacks. I mean, unless you don't want your committee to know you're asking a certain question, I could see that if you're a graduate student. But in general, people are very willing to share. I just watched a question that somebody asked this morning, and there's already 44 responses to it that are detailed with lots of links. So, I just feel like you can't go wrong with some of that. The other option would be certainly to get feedback from, of course, a trusted advisor. You may have already gone that route to try to solve your technical problem. I would also consider thinking about academic coaching. Defend and Publish, I know we talk about this. The podcast is one of our free services we offer, but certainly if you're interested in coaching, a lot of people talk about coaching as a big financial commitment. You can do just 1 hour with us, or even a half an hour, and ask about how to solve your problem. So one of the great things about that, we offer an executive coaching situation where you could just have a very, very small commitment because you just want to solve one thing. You just want to get some executive advice on how to deal with your technical issue. So that's always a great resource to think about too. Also, don't overlook your colleagues, people in your department, graduate students, people in your cohort. Ask around, because sometimes people even at the same level as you are having the same sort of problem, or they've already figured out how to fix it, and you guys can do some crowdsourcing in that way. Last two things to recommend. Number three is an obvious one, but I think it's worth repeating here. It's definitely worth breaking apart models. So if you look at an article and how it's put together, really taking it apart sentence by sentence, looking at how the introduction is written, how much introduction is there prior to launching into maybe a background section. All of that, the more you can break apart different models and figure out how they were put together, you can reverse engineer your own article or your own dissertation chapter. So again, it helps to get some models. And again, this might be something you have to ask around about, but definitely worth looking at that, because sometimes your technical issue is an issue where you just need to see it done and then you understand. So for me, I know that that's the case, especially with those time use diaries like we talked about. Last one, number 4, is getting some feedback. So I always recommend people to try to solve the problem and then get some feedback on it. So when I was writing my time use diary methodology section, I did ask a group of colleagues that I know that are doing some of the research in this area. And it was just short. It was 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs where I just wanted to set up a frame. And most people are willing to look at 2 or 3 paragraphs for you. It's not a giant time commitment. One scholar that I talked to said, hey, I welcome the interruption. This is great. I got 15 minutes before a meeting. I'm happy to take a look. That was very helpful to just try it and get some feedback before I got too far in. So this might mean for you just saying, I'm going to write 1 page and find out if I'm on the right track. And again, going to asking a writing group, asking a coach, crowdsourcing it, asking a colleague, or even just comparing what you wrote to those models we talked about. Those are all worthwhile strategies. So I hope those 4 technical writing block solutions helped you this week. As I mentioned, there'll be several other problems that we're going to explore, but if you want a little sneak preview, I definitely want to talk about some motivational blocks, just general paralysis, because I think that is sometimes a different thing than a motivational block. And then also just want to talk about some structural things with writing that can be just getting in your way and clogging up your writing pipeline. So I hope this helps, and happy writing this week.